All right, it looks like we have a good chunk of people and our logins have slowed down for now. So I will start introing. So my name's Liza Morse. I am a board member for the Green Mountain Audubon Society. We serve the northwestern counties here in Vermont. If you donate to Audubon, and you live in those counties, you are a Green Mountain Audubon Society member. If you have not donated to the Audubon Society and would like to, we have a donation link that I will drop momentarily in the chat. Additionally, we have a number of upcoming in-person events throughout the spring and summer. So check those out. I know for a number of them, registration won't open till a little bit later in the season, and we cap a lot of those events at 25 participants to maximize your experience and our ability to lead walks. So just keep an eye out for those. If you are not already on our mailing list, you can also subscribe to our mailing list to get alerts about when when registration for those events opens. This is our last online event, so we thank Kevin for closing out the season for us. And I will just say, the way we're going to run things tonight is that Kevin might pause at different points throughout his talk to check in with me. I'll be monitoring the chat for questions, but otherwise we're going to hold most of the questions for the end. But just don't hesitate throughout to drop any questions you might have in the chat box. I think that's all the important announcements I have for now. If you, for some reason, have to leave and want to come back, or the tech kicks you out, as has happened to people in the past, you are able to rejoin this at any time. Additionally, we post all our talk recordings on our YouTube channel, so please check this recording out as well as any past recordings of talks you may have missed. And with that, I'd like to introduce Kevin Tolan. Kevin began at the Vermont Center for Ecostudies in 2019, where his primary interests are vernal pools, grassland and mountain birds, and bioacoustic monitoring. Since eastern meadowlarks were listed in Vermont in 2022, he has coordinated statewide surveys to monitor their population. In addition to VCE, he is working on his graduate thesis at the University of Vermont, which focuses on invasive grassland plants and bobolink fledgling dispersal. In the coming years, he is excited to continue building upon his graduate research in order to increase the amount of long-term breeding habitat for Vermont's imperiled grassland birds. And with that, we thank Kevin, and Kevin, take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a beautiful night, and if you're spending it talking with us, I appreciate it. If you're involved with birding in Vermont, you might be familiar with the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. We run the Vermont eBird portal, but we're a nonprofit headquartered near White River Junction that does a lot of bird research. We're also doing a butterfly atlas right now, but things like loons, I think Eric, our loon biologist, might have given a talk for Green Mountain Audubon at some point. Lots of bee stuff and migratory work as well. I work with grassland birds a lot, as Liza mentioned, especially eastern meadowlarks. And I've given talks on the basics of grassland conservation in the past, and two folks have given talks on grassland birds to Green Mountain Audubon somewhat recently. And so it's like, how do I, add benefit to what people have already talked about? Two people, one from the state, Jill, and one from Mass Audubon, Hyla, have both given presentations. So if you're interested in learning more about the subject in the future, these are on the Audubon YouTube page. But I'm just going to kind of give a bit of a background on just grasslands as a whole and their biogeography, which is just basically the study of why things are living why they live there, right? Like, why is the Great Plains where the grassland birds are? Why is that where all the grassland habitat is? And to start with that, I'm going to go back. Well, not really go back. I'm going to start right where we are right now, modern times. And if you want to see grassland habitat in Vermont, most people know you kind of got to go to the Champlain Valley or maybe some other isolated areas across the state. This is in Shelburne, and this is like the typical grasslands we see now. Sometimes they're hilly, especially when they're going up from the valleys, interspersed with lots of hedgerows. But if you go back 200 years to how Vermont looked in the 1800s, much different story. This is the Burlington area, still some small trees coming up, but it's been almost entirely deforested. And when we think about grassland birds, this is kind of where we stop going back any further, because the conventional wisdom and what did kind of happen was in the 1600s, colonization occurred and much of the landscape was cleared. But there were grasslands here well before that time period. If you think about where we were 12,000 years ago, we were underneath massive sheets of ice, which is completely different than what we have now. And since then, there's been some major changes in the landscape. Once these glaciers receded, again, about 12,000 years ago, we underwent what's called primary succession. So you go from a landscape that's barren, just rocks, and microbes will come, start breaking down the rock into soil, mosses and grasses come, and eventually enough soil builds up that you're going to have these climax forest communities. And in Vermont, in modern times, that's kind of what we've come to. We have already built up this soil layer since glaciation, and now we have reached this near climax community of forest. This picture down below is in Alaska, I believe, and it's kind of just what it looks like after a glacier has receded. So a grassland environment as the soils get built up. And if you go to really active glacial areas, you can see this in practice. As these glaciers are receding, so say 120 years ago, you're starting to have a bit more greenery, but at 10 years after the glaciers receded, very barren. And this, everyone's heard of the Ice Age, and then they know that there were mammoths on the landscape, but like, this is kind of why we had mammoths and why grasslands were so expansive in the past. This is why we had this massive mammoth steppe, which is a steppe is a grassland environment. You had all these areas that were glaciated. Glaciers started to recede. You had a lot of fresh water still held up in the glaciers, so it was pretty dry. You had very little soil. And so for thousands of years, you had these massive grassland environments where now we have mostly boreal forests. And to kind of see what this would look like, you can go down to right on the convergence of Russia, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan. There's this remnant mammoth steppe prairie. It's kind of like the last isolated area that still has this mammoth steppe environment. And it's just, completely barren of trees because it's such a dry environment. And, in theory, this is kind of what it would have looked like. So I know what you're asking. What about migratory birds? That is a ton of habitat that migratory birds currently reside in. This whole area was still covered in ice. And there's been some really interesting work done comparing the breeding habitat now and back right after glaciation. So you can make these models that model the habitat. And it turns out that about 70% of our long distance migrant birds didn't have enough suitable breeding habitat in North America during that last glacial period. So on the left here is a hermit thrush with its modeled breeding habitat during the Ice Age. And it still has fairly large amounts of breeding habitat here. The veery, on the other hand, had very little, almost no modeled breeding habitat here during that last glacial period. And so within this time period, this past 12,000 years, we have seen a rapid amount of migratory behaviors begin. And so the authors of this study, Zink and Gardner, suppose that a lot of the species will oscillate between migratory and somewhat sedentary with each glacial cycle. And so just keep this in mind that when habitats are available, when there's suitable habitats, birds are extremely adaptable in their migration and just where on the landscape they're actually willing to live, provided there's suitable habitat. Now, during this period, I actually didn't know this, but we have records of mammoths in Vermont. There's down in Mount Holly, which is right in the Green Mountains. There was some molars and tusks found of mammoths. And I've never once seen an image of a mammoth depicted as being a deep forest species. And so this kind of goes that during this mammoth steppe time period, there was these massive herbivores that were wandering the landscape. And it's not just in Vermont, it's also throughout much of the southern New England area. This is part of a proposed environment called the Prairie Peninsula, where basically, I mean, it's not shown on the map here, but as there was this mammoth steppe, the prairie kind of expanded more into New England, and it got to be a interspersed coniferous prairie environment. And that's what you see with some of these last refuges of where the mammoths were here in the Northeast. Following glaciation, lots of water melted, and we end up having these massive glacial lakes that were impounded by ice where Lake Champlain now is. Here's Mount Mansfield, Camel's Hump. And so this is basically the I-89 corridor. And these were pretty expansive during the post-glaciation time period. So the one I'm zooming in here is the one we're zoomed in here. And then the whole Connecticut River Valley was a dammed up glacial lake, the Connecticut Valley Lake. There were some higher elevation ice dammed lakes as well. And then, of course, at some point, Glacial Lake Champlain and Lake Vermont eventually formed. And this has caused a really interesting, some interesting studies into the dispersal mechanisms between the Midwest and the Atlantic seaboard. Because there are, grassland species now on along the Atlantic seaboard, but how do they get here? And do they come up from the south, or is there evidence that grasslands existed in New England as well, or in northern New England? And it turns out that there appears to have been some dispersal of grassland species through Vermont. This is a little spittlebug, tiny, and they're found on some of the prairies on in the Michigan area, and then some of the heaths and sand barrens out in New England. And during this post-glaciation landscape, and you had these lakes going through, once these lakes dried, they underwent succession. So you had sandy areas where there was likely grassy environments coming through. And so we can see that there was this proposed migratory pathway that these grassland specific spittlebugs could have used to get from the native Midwestern prairies to native Eastern prairies without going through the southern area, which is the south is where it's kind of proposed that some of the birds came through. Two birds that we have seen come and go from New England are horned lark and dickcissel. Even though a lot of people think of bobolink and meadowlark as being those new arrivals during the colonization period, and they probably were in some regard, even in our earliest bird records, we still have mentions of bobolinks being in New England. But these two species only really started beginning to spread east in the mid 1800s. So if you get so it's the maybe 1860, and they started moving from Michigan through Ontario, and then by 1900, they were in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Vermont. But since the 1940s, they've basically completely retracted that entire range expansion. So again, these birds can be highly adaptable to where they are in the landscape, provided there's the correct habitat. And a lot of that correct habitat has been lost in the past 100 years. Now I'm going to kind of get into what's called secondary succession. So we have these massive grasslands. They are dry, they're barren, but eventually things get wetter, woody vegetation starts growing up. How do grasslands persist through that? And mostly it's through fires. So secondary succession is after you have that primary community, you have 100, 300-year-old forest, what's going to bring it back to being grassland or shrub habitat. And here, not fires aren't nearly as common in Vermont as they are elsewhere, but we do have some very rare fire adapted communities, some forests in the state that are really threatened now because we've been suppressing fire for so long. And there's a really neat map that was produced that shows like the fire regime period of New England. So the darker blues mean that like the fire period is more than 200 years. So of course that's going to be most of the forests where there's just old growth forest where probably not much disturbance happening. But you have areas down, especially on the coast, where there's a less than a 35-year fire interval. And when you have fire intervals that quickly basically replacing what's on the landscape, this is where you end up with these native grassland environments on sand barrens. One example of this is in Maine. This is the Kennebunk Plains. It's a TNC property, I believe, and this is like a quintessential sand plain grassland. You have a bunch of fire adapted pines and oaks. Here they had done the controlled burn on this half of the field, and this is a fantastic birding spot. Upland sandpipers, meadowlarks, grasshopper sparrows, vesper sparrows. It's really, really cool. And they burn, and then about a year or two later, once the grass begins vegetating, you start having the birds come back in. And here, this is a human-caused fire because that's how all fires are nowadays for the most part, for better, for worse. That's a point for another discussion. But prior to European colonization, these environments existed on the East Coast. Here is a photo from 1911, I think. And if you saw this anywhere, you'd be like, oh, this is just a complete, this is a native prairie. This is actually right on Long Island in a place called the Hampstead Plains. So this whole area of Long Island was in this essentially pristine grassland environment up until, late 1800s, early 1900s. They were able to, so here's a quote from 1911. At the present time, several other birds, which are infrequent elsewhere, especially certain sparrows and larks, find congenial habitat on the prairie. So this is naturally existing grassland in, what is geographically New England persisting. As is the story of grasslands everywhere, though, they never win. And so this was it in 1911, and this is it now. These little isolated orange bits are the only pieces left of this formerly fairly large grassland area. It's almost entirely now golf course. And this has been one of the main drivers for grassland declines, of course. It's just so easy to develop on them and convert them to agriculture. But there are other, I think, overlooked aspects of conservation that, because we never had to experience, we don't even think about. And one of those is the presence of herbivores on the landscape. Out in the Midwest, there used to be, millions and millions of bison all the way up through Pennsylvania into New York. And when you have this many herbivores on the landscape, they can help create these and maintain these large grassland environments. Tens of millions of them were killed for food and to suppress the indigenous populations. And with their decline, we lost a major driver of landscape composition. So we suddenly lost these millions of massive animals that were helping keep the landscape in its natural state. I think something that's also kind of interesting, just a fun bird point, is bison, because they're migratory. That's part of the reasons why brown-headed cowbirds adapted to be nest parasites, because they would have to move with the bison. And so the brown-headed cowbirds would leave their eggs in the nests, and they could leave while the eggs were cared for. Just shows the, how important brown-headed cowbirds, or how important bison were to the natural environment. They had these pretty unique, um, pretty unique relationships. Another cause of decline for grasslands, um, that wasn't, not much out here, but just the loss of prairie dogs. Prairie dogs are incredibly important for nutrient cycling. They provide a lot of um, habitat for other species like burrows. They provide food for predators. And when you lose the prairie dog, so on the left here is a prairie dog density of about 25 individuals per hectare. A hectare is 100 by 100 meters, and on the right is 2. So tons and tons, much fewer. You start getting totally different vegetative communities coming through. Different species, maybe more flowers than grasses, and you just lose the natural community type. And this is, again, a microcosm of what happens to grasslands. They either get their vegetative composition completely changed, either indirectly through um, the lack of disturbances, or through agriculture, or they just get lost to habitat fragmentation or permanent housing. Now, in the present day, these are our quote unquote native grasslands in the Northeast. Almost all on the west, and these are, largely caused by the rain shadows of the Rockies. So right here, if you have the Rocky Mountains, kind of right near the shortgrass prairie, right in the rain shadow, there's less water, it's drier, so you have shorter grasses. The further east you go, the further you get from the Rockies, you start getting wetter and wetter prairies. And that's how prairies are kind of thought of. They're thought of either wet or dry. If you're a dry prairie, you're going to have thicker, or you're going to have thinner vegetation probably. You'll probably have more frequent fires. And when we map it on a global scale of current prairies, this is how it kind of breaks down. You have these wet, as here, mesic to wet grassy biomes, and then you have the arid biomes. So kind of like the deserts and the more tall grass prairies. And they are all driven by extremely similar processes. And one really interesting example of that is the convergent evolution of birds here on these different environments. So if I was to say what 2 types of birds are these, Savannah sparrow and eastern meadowlark, pretty straightforward. Well, this is actually a yellow-browed bunting, which is native to Eastern Asia, and this is a yellow-throated longclaw, which is native to sub-Saharan Africa. So completely unrelated from our birds, not even the same family, but they look almost identical. And that's because it's the same evolutionary drivers between many of these environments. So longclaw, for instance, is found in the green, wetter areas in Africa, just like how the meadowlark is found in the green, wetter areas of North America. And so the same ecological drivers that are driving our grasslands in the Northeast are the same as the ones driving the ones in Africa, and the same that are driving grasslands in, Mongolia to some extent. And this is, again, similar to the vegetation being on a spectrum. That's how bird occupancy is also driven in grasslands. If you have taller, wet grasses, you'll probably have more leaf litter, you'll probably have less fires. And if you're a sedge wren, that might be where you want to be, in really wet areas that have maybe like reed canary grass. But if you are found in the drier, sandy pine barrens, or the like the grassland barrens, you mean maybe like a vesper sparrow, which is what you find in a lot of the sandier areas. We think of Vermont right kind of here in the mixed prairie area. So you might hear the term midgrass or mixed grass thrown around for birds like bobolink. And that's basically what it means. It's right kind of in the transition zone of the two. And that kind of makes sense. This is a pretty similar area to us latitudinally, somewhat similar climate regime. So this is kind of what is analogous to us in our Vermont human-made grasslands. one of the reasons why grassland conservation is so incredibly important in Vermont is that these are some of the most threatened habitats on the planet, if not the most threatened habitats on the planet. The red is what's been lost of these native grasslands. Blue is what's still remaining. So if you look at the tall grass prairies here, that's been almost completely lost. Less than 1% of the tall grass prairie remains. And this is the same thing that's happened on, almost, everywhere that has grasslands. This is kind of a similar trend we see. The wetter areas are really good for agriculture. And that is also represented in this map, which is a little bit more complicated to make sense of. But do you think of the blue as intact grassland and the yellow as planted grassland? And so again, this taller grasses are being replaced with either hay for, like in our cases, which is a lot of non-native grasses, or other types of agricultural produce. And as such, grassland birds are the quickest declining group of grassland or of birds on the continent outside of Hawaiian endemic species. I know that this is probably information you might have seen in some like the famous State of the Bird reports, which come out annually. And this is just kind of goes right hand in hand with what we've been seeing if the loss of their landscape. Between 2016 and 2022, they have had two different agricultural data sets for the state. And so I was able to compile those to kind of see what grassland was being lost and where. And so this is the amount of grassland habitat that was estimated to be lost between 2016 and 2022. And loss could mean either converted to agriculture, or it could mean fragmented to be too small, or it could mean developed into housing. And so outside of the places where we have almost non-existent grasslands like Essex County, and to some extent Grand Isle has, it's just a relatively small area, just in general, so it's not going to stack up quite the same. Grassland is being lost pretty rapidly, and there's a couple of towns in particular, I think, where there's been some large changes, but those could also be partially due to just how the data looks. Just the size of the grassland parcels kind of will, for variety of reasons, can dictate the analysis a bit. So there's a bit of refinement to do. But as a whole, grasslands are being lost, especially in the Connecticut River Valley, it seems, which kind of goes in hand with what we're seeing with the birds. And then up near the lake region, up near Newport as well, has been losing a lot of grasslands in recent decades. So we're going to talk about the threats now. Like, obviously, if we're losing habitat, what are we losing it to? And the main driver that I think a lot of people think about and are aware of is just habitat loss. And that's kind of how it is for a lot of species. Most species are losing habitat. But grassland birds in particular are losing habitat because they need large, unfragmented areas. So it's not just they're losing area, but say they have one 100-acre field and it gets turned into 10-acre fields. That might be the same area in terms of square footage, but the habitat quality is going to be so much lower for those smaller parcels. And so it's not just losing habitat area, it's losing the contiguous area that they really need. And so I've kind of broken it down into intensive agriculture, which is just more frequent cuttings of hay, which is one of the big issues in Vermont. Development, which is like the permanent change of grassland to housing or other human activities, or fragmentation, which is, again, that you might not be losing area, but you're still losing quality grassland habitat. And for the past decade, we've kind of been operating under the true assumption that the main driver for a lot of the grassland loss in Vermont was intensive agriculture. Yes, of course, we've lost a lot of the grassland habitat to reforestation and some to housing. But outside of that, like on the grassland we still have, we were losing the habitat because it's getting cut more and more frequently. And so since the onset of some of the research that has shown and demonstrated the efficacy of bird-friendly management, that's been the main target for our conservation efforts. But we're also really seeing now that not enough management is also a very, very bad thing. If you cut too much, there's not enough time for the birds to breed between cutting because they need about 2 months to like fledge and nest successfully. So obviously, if you're cutting once every month, you're going to have no successful fledging. But if you don't cut your field at all, it's going to become just invasive ridden. Grass is fairly susceptible to being invaded by plants, especially hay fields where you might be removing hay, which is a nutrient, which is nutrients, removing nutrients every year. And if you're not using it for active agriculture, you might not be putting any soil amendments in. So it can really reduce the success of grass persisting. And then just the entire vegetation structure changes. And grassland birds, for the most part, don't really seem to care that much about the species of the vegetation they're in. It's mostly that structure. So the way that a flower grows is a different structure to how grass grows. And because they put their nest on the ground and their only real defense is hiding it, they really like using dense grasses to nest and not wildflower meadows that are almost entirely pretty flowers. And so this is where we're really starting to run into issues now, where fields that have been managed for grassland birds for 10 plus years are now having reduced population sizes because the fields have not been cared for in a way that like maintains the hayfield environment, because that's what we've been doing for grassland birds for so long, is just to not cut. But now we know we need to cut, but that's expensive to cut. A couple of the species that we are most concerned about are smooth bedstraw, spotted knapweed, and reed canary grass. Smooth bedstraw forms a really dense knotted growth, and so interestingly, that's like one that we're really concerned about for like fledgling survival. Because if you're a fledgling, not able to fly yet, and you have to move through the grass, something like smooth bedstraw can really get you knotted up and takes a lot of energy to go through. And so when I say structure, that's kind of what I mean. Like this is a lot harder to go through than a bunch of upright grasses. And so we think that reduces the survivorship of fledglings. Knapweed and reed canary grass both make really dense monocultures. So they're the only thing growing. And that again really reduces the structure if you have no diversity in the species and the different growth patterns. You can kind of think about it like if you're familiar with the Audubon bird-friendly maple program, where it's you can't only have maple trees because that's not great for the species that live in the forest, because they need dead trees, they need trees on the ground, they need a mix of species. Kind of the same thing with grasses, but we don't really think about grasses in that same way because they're so fine scale that it's so easy to overlook. And I'm definitely guilty of overlooking the structure when I've surveyed fields sometimes. Invasive plants are invasive for a reason. One of the biggest is what's called the priority effect. So basically, if you are an invasive plant and you sprout first, you inherently are going to have better luck than if you're a native plant that sprouts after. And it seems that a lot of the invasive plants seem to have some type of priority effect over the native plants in the region. Another thing is self-remediation. So some plants can actually release compounds into the soil that reduce the competitiveness of other species of plant and help increase their own fitness and competitive ability on either native species or just other species in general. Again, I mentioned the edge effect, just reducing the habitat size, but also a lot of invasive plants can become established in hedgerows. And so if you have a 100-acre field and from the hedgerows, the outside 10 meters gets overtaken by invasive plants, you still have, you know, 100 or stuff like 90 acres of interior space to use. But if you're a 100 meter by 100 meter field and you lose 10 feet on both sides, you're going to lose a lot more space relative to the field as a whole. And then I mentioned it earlier, just the amendments thing. It does seem like that if you have soil that's been harvested for quite a while and you haven't been doing something such as putting lime down, which is just kind of basically just calcium, um, it seems that the invasive plants are really able to overpower the grasses. But if you use like some type of lime agent, sometimes that can help reinvigorate the competitiveness. This is some graphs from my grad work, just showing different vegetation profiles, different sites. So percent cover of these 1 hectare plots. And some of them, look pretty good. They have over 50% grass, but still they're at 25% smooth bed straw. And if that is having a negative impact on fledglings, that could be, pretty devastating to them. Some of these other sites though have, only about 25% grass or non-reed canary grass. That's going to have a much different impact on the amount of birds that are able to breed there. But we don't really know quite yet how big of an actual impact that has. There's a couple things in the chat, Liza. Is there anything that
Yeah,
you address now?
so a couple of questions. One is a throwback to earlier when you were talking about brown-headed cowbirds. Sarah was curious to learn a little more about the relationship between brown-headed cowbirds and bison. Why were cowbirds following the bison?
I think that the bison, when they step, they kick up dirt, and I think it just is easy foraging.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure of the exact relationship though.
Great. And then a question from Phoebe. I think it should be question slash comment. I think it should be noted that usually when people use the term grassland, they mean a natural old growth climax community, not an agricultural landscape. Fields and old field meadows may be suitable habitat for grass and birds, but they are not true grassland ecosystems by grassland ecologists' definitions. These fields are often very low diversity systems. A good example of a true Vermont grassland would be sand plains savanna. I mean, I think you kind of addressed some of that, but maybe you could speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, natural community perspective is going to be different than a wildlife perspective. A natural community perspective is looking a lot more at like the vegetation, what's actually found there. And I think Phoebe said it great that our hay fields are not grassland natural communities. They share traits, but they're definitely not the same. The soils are different. So yeah, 100%. When we say grassland from a wildlife biologist perspective, I think of it as birds that we associate with grasslands. If they're using it, in my perspective, it's acting as a grassland. That's kind of how I perceive things with like the bird thing. But you're 100% correct.
And so just to all way a question here,
Mm-hmm.
myself is like, even though these sort of non-natural grasslands that we have in Vermont are going to be lower diversity systems than native prairie grasslands, we still are concerned about reed canary grass because it just takes the diversity down to one species, correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and if you go to some like the true native grasslands in New England, you'll find spectacular endemic plants and yeah, I mean the vast majority of vegetation, 99% of it probably in our hayfields is non-native. But then non-native and invasive are a little bit different. So like our grasses that we are planted here are mostly European species, but they're not invasive in the way that they don't take over and form really dense monocultures, completely destroying the diversity of everything else. The grasses that we plant here take a similar form and structure to grasses in the Midwest, which is why the birds will use them. Whereas some of the flowers I'm talking about are invasive in the sense that they will just completely outplace everything. So it's kind of, there's a lot of nuance when you're talking about invasive, non-native, naturalized. But I'm not talking from a botanist perspective necessarily. I'm again talking from that wildlife, narrow-minded wildlife point of view.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. All right. That's
Yeah.
all we got for now. So full steam
Okay,
ahead.
cool. And so kind of going off a bit about like how, invasive plants are being so present. I just want to talk a bit about like and again, like the native prairies. How is this, not as much of an issue historically? Obviously, I mean, invasive plants have not always been here as we classify them as non-native. But a lot of times in the Midwestern prairies, you could think of a Midwestern prairie as the one on the right. You might have a fire in this one area and the birds can go and fly over here. And then maybe in 10 years, there'll be a fire here and they can return over here. And those fires can help take down like encroaching woody growth or flowers and stuff like that, because they wipe everything out. The first thing that will grow in general will be the grasses. And so you have really dynamic landscapes where every so often you'll have a patch of habitat that will be burned and restarted, and those birds will go elsewhere. In Vermont, because of how fragmented our landscape is now, because of how distinct how compared to the Midwest, our land ownership parcels can be smaller. So a lot of times our land is managed on a smaller field by field basis here. You might have one field that the person's been managing for grassland birds, but it's been like managed for the birds for 25 years and hasn't had that reset. Because if you were to reset this habitat and maybe to like replant it with grasses to get rid of all the invasive plants, then the birds wouldn't just be able to fly nearby and wait out until the grasses come back in. So by having these fragmented landscapes, we're inherently more restricted to our management because we can't just say, okay, every 5 years we'll burn each field and then they can just keep rotating around. A lot of times, if you're outside of the Champlain Valley, and even if you're within the Champlain Valley, if you're surrounded by cornfields and not other hay fields that provide suitable breeding habitat, your management options to get rid of the invasive plants are really, really small. And this, I think, is also shown in the way that these birds fledge new young. So this is another part of my grad project. We put transmitters on bobolinks when they were in the nest, and then we tracked them every day after they left the nest, up until about day 50 when they dispersed from the Shelburne area, and that was in like late August. And so even though they did move fields a bit, they all stayed pretty local. And so, that's awesome, right? If this is all owned by one person or by a group of people, you might have the potential to conserve birds during the highest period of death. Whereas if this was all, cut in mid-June, this would have been 0% productive. You can manage this small landscape and have full 100% success or 100% natural success for the amount of birds that will fledge. But what happens if this entire area is overtaken by invasive plants? That suddenly removes some of these fields that they're using and removes some of the connectivity. And so again, it's the way that they stay so local is actually a huge benefit to conservation because it allows us to conserve them on a pretty small, discrete area. But it also throws a lot of issues into the equation when you're trying to manage birds that won't readily go elsewhere. And then just one other threat I wanted to touch on quickly was pesticides, especially the neonicotinoids, which are well known for the harm they cause bees and other pollinators. But we've done some GPS tracking with the Smithsonian on meadowlarks, and hopefully that paper will be published. sometimes this summer. But a bunch of our birds that bred in Vermont overwintered on agricultural fields in the mid-Atlantic. So like in the Virginia area, a couple in the Long Island area as well, even. But they were all on agricultural fields. And so if you think in Vermont, when do we do, if you, even if you're a bird-friendly field, when are you going to do your planting? It's probably going to not be that the busiest breeding season. You're going to do some preemptive plantings and stuff, especially if you're down south where you don't have a harsh winter that's going to mess up your entire season. So they're going to be putting out different seeds and kernels that might be treated with these neonicotinoids, which is kind of the newest thing, where instead of just spraying the pesticides out, you can apply it to the seed directly and then put it out, and then you don't have to worry about runoff and wasting money. But if you're a little hatchier meadowlark that's overwintering its first time, and you're overwintering on an agricultural field, and you're just eating corn or soybeans or anything else, because that's what you're a little meadowlark. That's what you do. If less than 5 of these coated kernels could kill a meadowlark-sized bird, and I would imagine that would be if birds are on fields that are using neonic seeds, I bet that would be on the low end of what one might be exposed to. And so now we're able to use tracking technologies and things like eBird and other websites that we have a pretty good sense of where our birds are overwintering. And I'm really excited to hopefully in the future be able to take on more of a role in conserving where our birds are overwintering and not just where they're breeding. Because I think a big important thing that I think a lot of people know is birds aren't only threatened on their breeding grounds. A lot of times they're threatened elsewhere, and so we should be doing what we can to conserve them where they are. Any questions come up?
Yeah, going back to your thinking about your slide, thinking about burning and management of fields, are there management methods that would allow for burns to take place not during the breeding season, that is in order to prevent disturbing breeding? Are there factors that make burns in the late fall or early spring unproductive?
Yeah, burning hasn't been done a whole ton in Vermont's fields. We usually do haying. I do want to try using burning more, especially as we are having less and less farmers, and it's becoming harder and harder for grassland landowners to find someone to cut their fields. I would say that the issue with early spring burning is that it's wet, and so I'm not sure how well that would work. Um, I'm not entirely sure about the fall part. So there are definitely guidelines from other states for it. I just don't know of any for Vermont. It's Vermont in particular quite yet, just because it hasn't been done yet. But I'm hoping that it will be done more, and we can better understand that in the coming years.
Great, that's all we got
Well,
for now. And we have
great.
about 10 minutes left.
Yeah, I have
And we'll also keep taking more questions as they come.
great. Yeah, I have a couple more slides. Just so I talked a lot about like the future, or a lot about the past, a bit about the present. Just a quick look into like where we're going. Because these birds are really, really threatened by climate change. In particular, grasslands in general are very threatened to climate change. A lot of times they have very little variation in their topology. So there's very few opportunities for small microclimates to develop. A lot of times the vegetation is fairly short-lived. So if there is a change in climate, the vegetation composition rapidly changes. And I think maybe even more importantly is that as we start having more droughts, we might have increased fire in the Midwest. We also might be having more issues with food security. And so areas in the Midwest that are prime agricultural fields that might have at one point in time been conserved areas might be opened up to either grazing or conversion to monocrop. Um, Excitingly, though, in places like the Northeast, we have actually a good amount of conservation potential for them. This is from the full life cycle conservation plan for bobolink, which is which was authored by Roz Renfrew, who used to be at VCE and is now with the state. And it's basically looking at future climatic variables, the amount of protected area, the current uh, abundance of bobolink. And they identified county by county areas that have really high potential for bobolink conservation. And almost all of Vermont is ranked fairly highly. I think a lot of it is because of that climate sustainability. We have good topography. We have some already established grasslands, so we already have birds. And as the precipitation regime changes, under the assumption that it will continue to, we'll still have the environment to maintain these mid-grass, tall grass prairies. And the U.S. as a whole is actually predicted to lose a lot of its bobolink population. This is from the National Audubon Society showing expected climatic suitability for bobolinks. So the one on the left is a 1.5 degree increase, which is going to happen now at this point. And again, this is not necessarily habitat. This is just climate suitability. So the habitat would still have to be created to facilitate range expansion. But just based on climate, we're expected to lose a lot of the U.S. Bobolink habitat. All this red here on the left. Canada's supposed to actually get quite a bit. Again, I think a lot of that is the precipitation regime. A 3% increase by 2080 is, I think more on the extreme side, but it definitely not at all out of the question. And even more of the U.S. is supposed to be lost. In this scenario, bobolink are expected to be lost in Vermont. But again, this is a rough model. I argue that there's still hope in Vermont just because of how proactive we can be with conservation. But just as a whole, they are expected to lose so much of their habitat. And in Vermont, we have a really exciting opportunity to help provide to them into the future. And a lot of that can be guided through this full life cycle conservation plan. And this, interestingly, grasslands are also really good at carbon sequestration. Again, to Phoebe's point, I'm definitely talking more native grassland plants than I am talking our invasive plants. But grasslands in general sequester a lot of the soil or a lot of the carbon in the soil, unlike trees where it puts it into its above ground woody growth. And so that makes it less susceptible to fire to some degree because you can't just burn the ground to get all the carbon released. Which I had never really thought about, but when you start seeing the roots on some of these native prairie plants, it kind of makes sense a bit more, where you have these absolutely massive root systems to get down deep to the water, which is sometimes pretty far down, and also can pump massive amounts of carbon into the soils. And then I'll just end on the concept of a wicked problem, which is like one of those problems that's like so big and it's like, how do you even approach it? Because when you address one part, you make another part worse. So in this scenario, if you're going to try and get the yellow string unwound, you'll probably make all the other colors more tightly wound. And I think just in so many ways, this is what conservation is. It's just massive problems that have so many stakeholders. And conserving birds in general is a wicked problem, especially migratory birds, where they might go between 10 different countries, cross thousands of miles, go between. It's hard enough to work, with our neighbor states sometimes. To conserve birds down in Nicaragua requires a ton of work and collaboration. But one thing with grasslands that I kind of alluded to earlier is that the birds stay fairly local. And so the major threats to grassland birds, or one of the major threats, is that habitat loss in the breeding ground. And so we have an opportunity here in Vermont to conserve these breeding sites, which again is where the vast majority of their mortality will happen. and reduce some of those strings that make the problem so difficult, because we can do it in our own backyard and in our communities. You can do direct land conservation, which will have a really massive impact on these birds. Whereas, we have a ton of town forests, but adding more acres to a town forest might not be solving conservation issues for wildlife if that issue is limiting habitat down in cacao plantations or something like that. And so I guess that's why I think that grassland conservation should be a priority in Vermont, because we're going to be right in the right climate to be making a difference, and we're able to make a difference in our backyards. Whereas some birds, we have to send money down to their wintering grounds and do more work down there to conserve that habitat, which might not have a direct benefit to Vermont, which can be a hard sell to people that aren't vested into conservation. And so I just hope that when you see your bobolinks and meadowlarks, just say hi and be happy that they're still here. And just if you want to learn more about VCE, we're on social media and all that good stuff. We do monthly e-news and field notes about what's going on in nature that month. And thanks for Eliza for hosting me, and everyone for sticking around and listening to me ramble on about some things that give me so much happiness, but so much frustration too.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. I'm wondering if maybe you might, while I read you a question or two, you might be able to drop some resources into the chat for people who are interested in managing their own hay fields and grasslands that they might have. We have one question, and knowing what I do know about, habitat management for these birds, I suspect I know what you're going to say. But Nita asks, I have a 3-acre field, half of it wet, that is predominantly reed canary grass. I'm wondering what I can do to create better habitat. Bobolinks came through last year and sang for a few days. Maybe there are other species that would benefit from a field of native grasses, though 3 acres is not big. Is there a way to get rid of reed canary grass without herbicides? Frequent mowing seems to help, but then you have lawn, which is obviously not that useful. So yeah, 3 acres might be better served. It sounds like maybe for pollinators perhaps, but I'm curious what your advice would be.
Yeah, I'd say that'd probably be better for pollinators. Like I understand that bobolinks might move through. They do like eating seeds and stuff during migration, so you'll find them in wet areas, but I assume they'd be a little too small to breed. It seems like reed canary grass just absolutely annihilates that diverse structure that they need. And especially if it's wet, then they wouldn't nest there, because they can't nest in standing water because they put their nests directly on the ground.
Is there a way to get rid of the reed canary grass that you
I
found to
mean,
plan for
none
them?
that I've heard of outside of just what I found on Google. I haven't heard of anything. Again, obviously, I think that the thing people like doing is trying to do it mechanically to keep down on the pesticides, but that I don't know how great that works for canary grass. So I honestly I don't have. That's one of the issues. I don't have a great response for taking care of them, because I think for some species there just is not a great solution. So sorry I couldn't be more of a help.
Yeah, no, I know that out in the Midwest, I've heard of doing sort of a 1-2 punch of herbicides plus then following up with like semi-frequent burnings,
Mm-hmm.
which obviously would not be super practical here, particularly on a small parcel.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting lots of thanks.
Oh, thank you.
Leonardo says, interesting presentation. We're doing some tall grass restoration and grassland bird conservation at the Rouge National Urban Park at the east end of Toronto, Canada. Looking forward to networking about grassland conservation on Eastern North America. Thank you. We love having some Canadians on the call, so that's exciting.
Yes, definitely.
Um, yeah, if anyone else would like to drop any other questions, we'll just hang out here for another minute or two. And maybe Kevin, would you be able to maybe drop your contact info into the chat if people have any other
Yep.
questions?
Let me do it.
And please check out our links for in-person events. Also, if you go to our website and scroll down to the bottom, you can put in your email and sign up for our newsletter. We do our best not to spam you overly much. We just email about our upcoming events. So we hope to see you out in the field looking at some migratory birds this spring. And with that, we're getting lots of thanks. No more questions. It looks like you've answered all the questions, Kevin. We have no more
Oh,
questions.
great.
So thank you so much. And with that, I will wish everyone a great night and our thanks for attending from Green Mountain Audubon Society.
Yeah. Thanks,
All right.
everyone. Have a good
Bye,
rest of your
everyone.
evening.